Vast changes to the education and tax system. Dozens of new laws take effect soon. We examine in this week's Capitol Report. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's Capitol Report. I'm Julie Bartkey. July 1st not only signals the beginning of the first full month of summer, it also signals the beginning of dozens of new laws added to the Minnesota books. Minnesota students will feel the impact from early childhood, including all-day kindergarten, through the college level, with a 2-year tuition freeze in place for state higher ed institutions. Homeowners could see a reduction in property taxes, and if you're planning on making a purchase online, you can prepare to factor in sales tax. Here to discuss the impact of those is Senate Majority Leader Tom Bakk. Thanks for joining us today.
You're welcome.
Senator, let's begin with some of those changes that do take place, as I said, on July 1st. Many of these laws were wrapped in big omnibus bills. Which ones do you think are going to impact Minnesotans the most?
Well, there were a lot of provisions passed relative to property tax relief and education funding. New money for early childhood scholarships, free all-day kindergarten for every kindergartner in the state, a 2-year freeze in college tuition at our MnSCU campuses, a 1-year freeze at the University of Minnesota in undergraduate tuition. Cities and counties who currently have to pay sales tax on their purchases now will not be subjected to sales tax anymore. That's going to save cities about $100 million a year. Currently, they're having to levy property taxes in order to pay the state that sales tax. Additional money in the renter's credit, additional money in the property tax refund program that people are eligible for. So I would argue a very strong session for property taxpayers and for education.
Okay, and Amazon, let's go back to the tax bill in particular, and one portion of that was the excuse me, the sales tax on internet purchases. Amazon recently announced that it's going to end its relationship with many affiliates in Minnesota who direct online users to their website. So did you anticipate any other potential fallout as a result of this portion of the tax bill?
Well, that's a provision that I initially carried probably back in 2007 or 2008. The state of New York was the first state to impose the sales tax on online sales. Now, what citizens need to know is the sales tax is still owed when you make a purchase online, but if the business doesn't have a physical presence in Minnesota, they don't have an obligation to collect it, but you still, as the purchaser, have an obligation to pay it, and it's called a use tax. But compliance is very low, so that the Amazon provision, as it's commonly referred to, simply has the retailer collect it at the point of sale rather than have the actual purchaser remit it to the Department of Revenue when they file their income tax.
So what kind of message do you think it sends for Amazon to say, well, it's going to pull its business with the Minnesota affiliates?
Well, Amazon came to see me back when I was tax chair in probably 2007, 2008, when I initially proposed it when it had been done in New York and prevailed at the district court level in New York. I tried to do it in Minnesota then. And when they came to see me, they said, well, Senator, you don't understand. If you ask Amazon to collect sales tax, we're not going to do business in Minnesota any longer. I said, oh, really? I said, let me explain something to you. I said, if I need a toaster, I'm going to buy a toaster. Which means if I can't buy it online, I'm going to buy it from a brick and mortar store in Minnesota. It's a very, very important provision. It was supported strongly by a lot of Minnesota businesses and big ones, including Target and Best Buy. It was their #1 priority of the Minnesota Retailers Association for several sessions now. Our online bricks and mortar stores are the real competitive advantages when companies like Amazon can come into Minnesota and sell products and avoid the sales tax. And Best Buy sent a very strong message to the Capitol, and the way they would talk about it is our stores are just becoming showrooms. Customers will come to our store, they'll browse through the television sets or whatever electronics equipment they want to buy, they'll decide what they want to buy, and then they'll go home and they'll buy it online to avoid the sales tax. And on a large purchase, $1,000 or $1,500 television set, it's real savings when they're allowed to get free shipping. So it was really putting Minnesota businesses at a real competitive disadvantage to online sellers. And even though I've heard from some constituents who are doing some online business that are upset about it, it really is the right tax policy.
Let's talk about a few other issues that seem to be bubbling to the surface a little bit related to the tax bill. One is the sales tax on farm machinery repair services, and another would be the sales tax on storage units. What are you hearing from businesses and farmers as you travel the state right now and as these provisions become?
Well, not a lot yet, because I think people really haven't digested some of the sales tax changes. What I wanted to do, and that were initiatives on the part of the Senate, is I wanted to do sales tax reform. We proposed a much broader program that was finally enacted into law. Our provision would have actually lowered the sales tax rate from 6.5% down to 6%. But the governor didn't want to impose any new sales taxes on consumers. And what I wanted to do in the context of larger sales tax reform was take the sales tax off of cities and counties. I think it's very poor tax policy to have them collect sales tax or remit sales tax and have to collect property taxes to pay it. And then I wanted to do the upfront exemption on capital equipment for business purchases. Very expensive, about $150 million to allow businesses to get an upfront exemption versus having to go through the refund process. The governor had a lot of anxiety about sales tax reform. He had proposed a larger, much broader sales tax reform proposal early in the session that he later backed away from. But he did want to do those two provisions that I wanted to do. So we went looking for, is there a menu of sales tax provisions that we could enact to pay for these two reforms that I think most Minnesotans agree are the right policy. And those are the things we settled on, and we specifically delayed the warehousing sales tax provision until next April because it hadn't been well vetted over at the Department of Revenue, and we're not sure what potential implications are. I met with some representatives of warehousers earlier this week and have told them, you have to bring me real examples. You just can't say it's going to hurt my business. You have to show me real examples of where business is going to leave Minnesota and not going to warehouse here any longer because of this tax provision. And if there are unintended consequences in that, it's something we'll certainly revisit next year.
Okay, and let's look ahead to next year a little bit. There are many issues that remain unresolved at the end of last session, and some of those include, some of the higher profile ones included the anti-bullying bill, minimum wage, and transportation funding, just to name a few. So what do you expect work-wise to happen over the interim?
Well, it'll be a pretty brief session next year. It's not our budget year. I'd like to see it something less than 10 or 12 weeks if we can. We're going to go in on February 25th. There will be some committee hearings over that time to talk about some of those issues. The bullying bill passed the House and it was on the Senate floor, but we just ran out of time. So in the Senate, it's laid on the table, I believe, in the Senate. I think something will pass on that next year. I don't know, I believe we call it the Safe Schools bill. I don't know if the House version that's passed is a lot different. Really, there was one piece of legislation that's critically important that we get passed next year. The Senate passed it, and the House did not get to it yet. And it addresses the Minnesota sex offender program. We have the federal courts breathing down our neck here that when people have served their allotted time in prison under the Constitution, they have to be released. But we're currently moving them, once they've served their time, over to a civil commitment program called the Minnesota Sex Offender Program. The federal courts are weighing in and saying you do not have the right to incarcerate people indefinitely once they've served their term. So the facility we currently have them in is much like a prison, and we're going to have to find some alternative ways to house them in less restrictive environments than a prison environment, or I believe the federal governments are going to come in and take over our program. It's critically important. It should have got done this year. Fortunately, the Senate did get around to it. I expect the House is going to get around to that relatively early in this session.
Okay, Senator, my last question for you is there have been several news articles in a variety of newspapers on potential political fallout because of some of the ways legislators voted on various issues or didn't vote, and it goes in both parties. Some examples were the tax bill and same-sex marriage. So now, what do you think? As majority leader, it's part of your role to try to mitigate any political damage. Do you anticipate putting out a lot of fires? What have you been hearing so far?
Well, the Senate's not on the ballot until 16. So historically, the Senate has always been probably a little more aggressive in the first year of a four-year term. For instance, the Senate did actually vote on a large transportation package that would have invested a significant amount of money in our roads and bridges through a gas tax. expanded the transit build-out both in the metropolitan area and in outstate Minnesota. But that's tough politics in an election year, so I don't know if the House and the governor are going to be willing to consider that this year or not. I think something's probably likely going to happen on the minimum wage, might even happen federally. So this will be the year also where we make a decision what voters might expect to see on the ballot in the form of proposed constitutional amendments. This will be the year where we do a pretty substantial bonding bill. They're historically done in non-budget years, so I think you'll see a bonding bill in the neighborhood of $800 million to $850 million probably in a bonding bill this next session. I think we'll have pretty strong bipartisan support for that. There's a lot of good projects in both Democratic and Republican districts.
So you're not too worried about political fallout in the Senate based on other votes?
Well, there always is. There's a certain number of districts that are swing districts that go back and forth, Democrat and Republican, depending on voter turnout. Democrats tend to do better in presidential years than in non-presidential years because turnout's higher, and for some reason in Minnesota that's favored Democrats over the decades. So I think most people, if history means anything, expect Democrats to have a little bit tougher election year than they had in 2012. I think the election, voters clearly saw a contrast between the previous biennium with Republican control. I often have told people what a difference an election makes. I mean, a year ago we were sitting here preparing, or 2 years ago in the 2011 session with the Republican legislature. Right now, today, we were planning for a government shutdown. Ended up in an extended one, longest one in the country's history. We ended up resolving it by historic borrowing from our K-12 schools, eliminating the homestead credit that homeowners saw. What a contrast if you fast forward to this budget session 2 years later. You see significant investments in K-12, all-day kindergarten, early childhood, property tax relief, restoring the state and local government relationships by putting new state money into the local government aid and county program aid programs so the state can be a stronger partner in delivering services at the local level. And I think voters will decide whether they view that as a successful session, as progress, or not. And certainly there will be Republican seats that become Democratic in this election. There will be Democratic ones that likely become Republican. I think the governor will get reelected. I think the governor's done a very, very good job. I see his poll numbers look very favorable. And I'm very much looking forward to serving with him in this next session.
Senate GOP caucus leader David Hann joins me now to talk about these new laws that take effect July 1st. Thanks for joining us today.
Good to be here.
Senator, let's begin. Dozens of laws are ready to roll in. There are many from the tax bill and from the education bill. Just overall, which do you think are going to make the most impact on Minnesotans?
Well, I think clearly the tax changes will be the ones that will have the most significant impact on the economy and on citizens' pocketbooks, and I think will have the biggest impact across the state. I think it's interesting that we're now getting to the end, as this is being filmed here, down toward the end of the fiscal year. So we've been operating under essentially the Republican budget that was passed 2 years ago. And we've seen, I think, a pretty good economy and some job growth and employment growth and surpluses in the budget. And we've been sort of operating under that. And now we will see, starting in July 1st, a change, as you mentioned, these new laws going into effect. And the tax laws are going to be significant. How that's going to affect growth in the economy, growth in job production, whether it'll have an effect on people staying here in Minnesota, investing in Minnesota, all those things we have yet to see. So I think that will have a significant effect. We'll see how that plays out into the future.
Senator Tom Bakk contends that the property tax relief is pretty significant and the elimination of the state sales tax paid by cities and counties. He thinks that these are far-reaching positive benefits. In your opinion, are there enough good parts of this bill to outweigh what you consider the not so good, the bad parts?
Well, in any budget, with all the bills and all the complexity, there's always good things, no matter who's in charge. We all know that. There's good and bad in everything. I would say on balance that the negatives outweigh the positive. Property taxes, for example. There's no question that property taxes are a local decision. We at the state level, there's very little that we have to do with property taxes. There are arguments that are made, and the DFL is making those arguments that we've done some things that are going to have the effect of causing local property taxes to go down. But historically, that has never happened. You do things like adding to the LGA, for example. And the argument is that when you increase LGA, that gives the local governments an opportunity to lower their property taxes. But they never do. 20 years of history tells us that never happens. So even though the argument is being advanced that they've done things that will cause those property taxes at the local level to go down, I don't think there's much evidence to show that it will actually happen.
Some of the other consequences related to the tax bill include Amazon ending its relationship with affiliates in Minnesota who direct online users to go to their website. There's some pushback from farmers who are going to be paying sales tax on repairs to farm machinery. Do you anticipate other potential fallouts as a result of the new laws rolling in?
Well, I think there absolutely will be. This whole warehousing sales tax that has been talked about, even though it's going to have a delayed implementation, there are people who already today are beginning to make plans about how they're going to handle that. I think that's going to have a very, very dramatic impact if it stays in place, and there's been some talk about it already from Democrats even, about maybe repealing that portion of the law. So I think as businesses look at the effects of these laws and what they're going to have to do to comply compared to other places, other states, I think there's going to be decisions made that will have a negative effect on Minnesota's economy and the potential for investment and growth in Minnesota. We should be, I think, very concerned about that.
Let's talk a bit more now about the impacts to the students in Minnesota. We have early childhood scholarships. We have voluntary, fully funded all-day kindergarten. There are 2-year tuition freezes for the state's institutions. And something that's really fallen off the radar for many is the new way to assess students prior to graduation instead of doing a standardized test. You're passionate about education, and do you see any good, what's good? Where's the meat in this?
Well, I think, to me, the good part of the education bill that was passed is that there was some money put into the general education formula, without getting into the weeds on the arcane issues of education policy. The general education formula is the amount of money that school boards get to manage and decide pretty much on their own how they're going to spend. And it's always a good thing, I think, when you're talking about funding education, to try to give local elected boards some leeway and some ability to decide how to spend money. So I think it was good that there was an effort to put funding into that general education formula. So I think that is a good thing. Some of the other things that you mentioned, maybe not so good. I'm not so sure that, for example, devoting the money that we did to the all-day kindergarten. We already have a significant investment in all-day kindergarten. A lot of it is done through the efforts of local districts. I think that it would have been better to have taken that funding and put it onto the general formula, for example, and giving it the option, giving districts the option to expand their all-day kindergarten if they wished. I'm not so sure that putting this out there and saying it only can be used for that purpose, there are some districts that are going to have a struggle making that use of those funds. They might have to look at building buildings or building classrooms to take advantage of that. I think it would have been better to use those monies more broadly. So I think that to the point about testing, we had in place 2 years ago some expectations about what was expected to graduate. There's evidence that we saw that showed that those expectations were actually working to reduce the achievement gap. I thought it was remarkable that the Democrat majorities decided to give up on that after a relatively short time of trying to have those expectations, and then turn it over to a new regimen that says, well, we're going to have a standardized testing in place, but there would be no sort of cut score, no expectation of what you have to have as a score in order to pass. Those things, to me, are not evidence that there is a commitment to expectations, high expectations, a commitment that we are going to make sure our graduates really are prepared.
Now, we couldn't spend the entire program just talking about the education components, but given this is supposed to be a broad conversation, let's move on to some of the unresolved issues from the end of session. As minority leader, how active would you like to be in working on some of these issues that are likely to surface again next session? We've got transportation funding. We have the Safe and Supportive Schools Act. We have just a plethora of different bills that are likely to come up. How active do you hope to be, and how active do you expect to be?
We expect to be very active. Next year is going to be an election year for the House. We're not up for election in the Senate, but the House will be. And so I think there will be a slightly different dynamic as at least half the legislature prepares to go into election. There clearly will be a bonding bill. That's always been traditionally in the second half of the biennium. That does require votes from the minority, and so there's going to be a considerable amount of negotiation about what goes into that bonding bill. And typically there will be some expectation that perhaps we can translate our support for bonding for some support on the other side for things that we may want to do. So I think that that bonding issue will become a part of the dynamic of the next session. You mentioned the Safe Schools Act, the anti-bullying bill that was pushed at the very end. I think there might be an effort to bring that back, but that was a huge, costly mandate, $40 million to do something that all school districts today have, which is policies addressing bullying. I think there's real questions about why we need to do this at that level and the way it's being proposed, at the cost that's being proposed. We'll see if that comes up. That's a very controversial proposal. We'll see if that comes up in the next session.
Senator, I would like to ask you for the last question, the similar question I asked Senator Bakk. There have been several news articles on potential political fallout because of the way some legislators voted on issues or didn't vote on certain issues. Some of the examples that were cited included the tax bill and the same-sex marriage legislation. So as minority leader, given that it's your role to try to mitigate any political damage to members of your caucus, how challenging do you think it's going to be between now and the next election for you? Like you said, we're 3 years out in the Senate, but do you think you're going to be putting out a lot of fires or not?
Well, a lot of these issues about candidates and members, a lot of that is local. The way Minnesota politics works, candidates are endorsed by local political units, and they decide who their candidates are going to be. As a Senate caucus, we are working with these local party units, and we accept the people who are endorsed at the local level as their candidate. We try to work with them. If they ask us to, or if we're allowed to, we will give them our advice and counsel, but they are the ones who ultimately choose from among their citizens in their community who they want to represent them. So if they are unhappy with the votes that their local people have taken, they will make that known, and they will kind of sort through that on their own in their own way. Sometimes that can be challenging. I know there are votes that have happened in the past. I remember a few years back with the override of the transportation gas tax. That was problematic, and there are these things that occur. But a lot of that is sorted out at the local level. We try to, at the caucus level, to try to work with the local people. We try to give them our advice. We hope that they will not act rashly and maybe remove somebody, a member who's been a good member, just because they're unhappy with a particular vote, but sometimes we don't get the right to decide.
Is it too early to begin sending your message out to voters, preparing for the next Senate election?
Well, it's never too early. You know, what we do here is in the fishbowl, and everybody watches what we do, and a lot of what we do obviously has political overtones. We think that the direction that we've been taking as a state under DFL leadership in the House and the Senate and the governor's mansion, we don't agree with that direction. We think it needs to be modified. We'll have an election next year for the House and for the governor. We're going to be out talking about the things that we've seen in the last 2 years under a Republican budget and the things we think have been very positive as a result of that, and we're going to try to remind the voters of the positive things that have occurred under that budget, and we're going to also point out what we think are some of the negative things that are going to occur under the new DFL budget, and we'll try to remind the voters of that.
Thousands of lawmakers will converge on Minnesota over the next 13 months to share their thoughts and ideas on some issues facing Minnesota as well. Now joining us is Senator Sandy Pappas, the President of the Senate. She's spearheading efforts to welcome these lawmakers, and we welcome you to the Capitol Report set. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Let's begin with these two conferences. We have the 2013 annual regional meeting of the Council of State Governments.
That's right.
And the 2014 annual meeting of the National Conference of State Legislators. So in your opinion, what does it mean for Minnesota to be hosting these events?
It's a fabulous opportunity to showcase what a wonderful place Minnesota is. And we're very proud that our own Representative Alice Hausman from St. Paul is the chair of the regional conference. And she and her staff have done a fabulous job. I've helped a little in putting events together for this conference, which will be in St. Paul in July.
And the other conference, again, with so many people coming in, what does Minnesota gain by hosting something like these two conferences?
Well, people come for and bring their families, and they come and they make it an extended vacation. So we have a fabulous spouse and children's program to showcase the aquarium at the Mall of America, the riverboat rides, the Science Museum, the History Center, the Ordway, so many regional amenities that we have. Plus we're tapping into I know kind of our regional famous people. Anne Bancroft is going to speak at the conference. Regent Patty Simmons is going to talk about the Mayo story at the conference. And then we'll also be hosting national figures like John Meacham, who is a very well-known Pulitzer Prize-winning historian.
So you're obviously excited about this. As the Senate president, you're well versed in the many issues that confront Minnesota and other states as well. So if you could you give us a flavor for some of the issues that you're expecting to be brought up and discussed?
Well, workforce development is going to be one thing. Everyone's looking at their educational systems and how they can better prepare children and college students for the future. Water quality is very important in the Midwest and in the Canadian provinces, so that will be a big issue. And energy issues in general, there'll be a special field trip to the St. Paul District Energy, which is unique in the country because it supplies energy to the downtown St. Paul and to the capital through wood waste, primarily renewable resource. All the committees will be meeting, talking about health care, as I said, education, environmental and energy issues, transportation issues. There's a full menu of issues that will be discussed for the 700, 800 participants.
And Senator, states' rights have become a growing issue in the nation. So with states fighting to shape their own policies on things like immigration, health care, and voting security, do you think there's a shift in governance, in your opinion, from a centralized Congress to a legislative state house?
It's always been a tension in American history as to how much power the federal government has and how much power the states have. And it is an argument that we should be making policy on some of these broader issues, especially things that involve climate change on a national level. But the states are impatient, and if Congress isn't gridlock and not able to get things done, then the states step into the vacuum. So you see that with both the Council of State Governments and with the National Conference of State Legislators, a lot of policy going on the local level.
And do you think Minnesota is perhaps a showcase in this area as well, particularly with the health insurance exchange?
Well, certainly in that case, we're one of the early states to have adopted the Affordable Care Act and the implementation of that. But in many ways, Minnesota has not been keeping up. So I think we will have things to learn from our colleagues from other states and certainly from the 4 Canadian provinces that are part of this organization. And
Senator, viewers who are watching this might be saying that they hope that they're not paying for these conferences. Are they funded separately? How is the funding mechanism
The funding
designed?
is actually, we solicit sponsors for the funding. So the taxpayers' dollars are not being spent. Even for our own participation, we are allowed to solicit dollars from corporate sponsors and labor sponsors, and that's how we pay for these conferences.
And somebody might also be interested in volunteering. What should they do if they are indeed interested?
Well, actually, you have to be a state employee. We have all the volunteers that we need from the group of state employees that are spending some of their summertime volunteering at these conferences.
Finally, Senator, what do you hope all of these legislators and their families walk away from Minnesota knowing about our state that perhaps they didn't know before?
Well, certainly I hope that they learned a lot at the conference, but I also obviously hope that they find out that Minnesotans are friendly people, that it's a beautiful place to visit in the summer, that they thoroughly enjoy themselves, and they plan to return.
And that concludes this week's program. From all of us at Senate Media Services, I'm Julie Bartkey. Thank you for watching this week's Capitol Report.